What's going on, guys? So as I have been sharing with you all my journey, which has really been deconstructing Christianity and in some ways just religion as a whole, I have pondered and thought about many things that I have yet to share with you guys. And one of those things is the concept of salvation, which I have been thinking about for the past couple weeks, but more specifically in the biblical context, what gets you into heaven versus what doesn't. And I think these questions that I'm going to propose to you all are questions that we really need to be asking, because once you look past the surface of some of the scriptures that I'm going to mention, something doesn't add up. So to start things off with this topic of conversation surrounding salvation, I'm going to bring up two key verses that oftentimes Christians will bring up or quote when talking about salvation. So the first verse I'm going to mention is Romans 10:9. And if you had anything to do with growing up in church, I bet you know exactly the verse I'm talking about. It says that if you confess with your mouth Jesus as Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. The second verse is John 14:6 that says, Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. So from these two verses, what we gather is that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and you believe that he is the way, the truth, and the life, then he is the way to the Father, i.e. heaven. You will be saved. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart, then you will be saved. And Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through him. So by those two verses alone, traditional Christianity says that, okay, Jesus is the way. Jesus is the way to heaven. So those two verses seem like a pretty well constructed biblical idea of what salvation is and how to get to heaven. But let's look at the interpretation of the verse, because there's actually a couple different ways with the John 14:6 verse. There's a couple different ways that you could interpret that. So going back to John 14:6, one way that you could interpret that verse is when Jesus is saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Himself, he, like the person of Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. So accepting him means that you are going the right way, you are getting life, and you know the truth because you accept the person of Jesus, which that, follows the Romans 10:9, which says if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, you will be saved, right? So that's the first way that you could interpret that verse. So the second interpretation could be that the way that Jesus is living his life, that he is exemplifying with his life, could mean that the authentic pursuit of truth is the way that will give you life. And this is what Jesus exemplified with his life. He lived it out in his life. So that's another way that it could be interpreted. And I'm going to stop there because here's the difference between the first two interpretations. The first interpretation kind of allows you to just have a sort of standstill. Like, I've accepted Jesus and he is Lord, he is Savior, so now I'm getting into heaven. It's not that you have to do anything about it. It's just if you say the words with your mouth, if you accept him as Lord, then you will be saved and you will go to heaven. The second interpretation, there's an actual action involved. It requires you to take action. It requires you to authentically seek out truth. And the people that I'm aware of that seek out truth do find life, and they do find that that is the way that they want to live life. And the first interpretation doesn't necessarily mean that you're trying to find what is actually true. It kind of insinuates that you've already found truth, and that truth is Jesus, and so you're kind of at the end of the journey. But the second way is a journey. It's almost the beginning of a journey, and it's the journey of finding truth, authentically finding truth. And I have a whole series on this channel of truth and what it means to find truth and how do we find truth and what is true and what's not truth. And through that series and through my studies, I've learned there can be unnecessary hurts and pains from not knowing the truth and not living out the truth. But when you are authentically seeking out truth, you find life in that. And Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So wouldn't that mean finding that way and authentically seeking out truth that brings you life is the right way, and that is the way to the Father, i.e. heaven? So the third way that you could interpret this verse is a more new agey way of interpreting it, which has to do with Christ consciousness. Is it the way that Christ thought? Because there's a reoccurring theme in the New Testament surrounding giving up the old self. And even in Romans 12, 1 and 2, it talks about transforming the mind. And in Colossians, 3 and 10, says, "Do not lie to another, since you laid aside the old self in its evil practices, and you have put on the new self, who is renewed to a true knowledge according to the image of the one who created him." So there's a recurring theme in the New Testament of this renewing of self and renewing of mind, because in order to renew yourself, you have to renew your mind and renew your mindsets. So does John 14:6 talk about consciousness and renewing the mind into an evolving Christ consciousness? It could be. I have heard New Age arguments that use these Bible verses for, some sort of justification for Christ consciousness. So that is apparently another way that you can interpret this verse. So which interpretation is it? Obviously, traditional Christianity normally agrees with the first interpretation. But here's why I have some issues with that. So as we've already stated, based on those two Bible verses, we get the concept of salvation. But one thing that Christians really, or the church in general, just takes out of that verse is the one part in Romans 10:9 that says, "And confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord." In other words, there's these magic words that you can say that will get you into heaven. So from there, people say, okay, yes, I am a sinner. Lord, I confess that you are Jesus, Lord of my life, and that you have raised from the dead. And okay, cool. But the very next part of the verse that you can't ignore doesn't say confessing with your mouth that Jesus raised again from the dead. It says, and if you believe in your heart that Jesus was raised from the dead, for with the heart comes belief. Now, it is because of this verse right here that I did my intense, in-depth study of the difference between faith and belief. I mean, honestly, when I started questioning everything about what I believe, I was wondering, am I saved? Am I not saved? What does this even mean? And, Christianity, the church just throws around the terms faith and belief. And so you get really confused. It's like, are they the same thing? Are they different? Because you clearly read, after reading James and Hebrews in the New Testament, and then seeing a lot of other concepts in the New Testament that talk about belief, you see that they are very different things, but yet people throw them around like they're the same thing. So I'm like, I need to figure this out because of this verse. Like, what is it? Like, am I saved? Am I not saved? My salvation, whether or not I'm a Christian or believe in God, could depend on the difference between these two concepts. And newsflash, it does. But first, I want to say, if you have not watched my videos on the difference between faith and belief, I would encourage you to do that. And if you don't want to do that, then you can just trust my work, take my word for it. But from all of that study, what I have gathered is that faith is a choice, belief is not. Belief, in my opinion, and from what I've researched and seen, comes from the knowledge of experience. And oftentimes, before that experience, there was a journey of faith. And if that is a weird and hard concept to grasp, either, go watch those videos or just take me, just trust me in what I'm saying. Either or, it doesn't matter to me. But I'm going to move on because I don't have time to go into it in this video. But with there being a distinction between belief and faith, it really makes you think a lot more on what Romans 10:9 is actually saying. So obviously, confessing with your mouth is the easy part, but what does it mean to believe with your heart? Well, I don't think it has anything to do with saying you believe in your heart, but I do think it will lead you on a journey of faith that might cause you one day to believe. And in John 6:29, it actually says that the works of God is to believe in the one who God sent, which would be Jesus. And if you believe Jesus in your heart, then you are saved, and you believe that He raised again. That is Romans 10:9. But it's work. It's not just saying it. with your mouth. It's not just the magic words. And also the work to believe directly correlates with James 2:7 that says faith without works is dead, which also, if you didn't watch my last video, it was about the journey of faith, and that it seems like it's just been lost in religion and the Christian tradition and all that. But the true journey of faith, the dark night of the soul, what that looks like. Faith without works is dead, and the works of God is to believe in the one that He sent, which would lead you to belief, which if you believed in Jesus in your heart that He raised from the dead, then you will be saved, as well as confessing with your mouth. So by that standard of belief, salvation does not happen in a day, and it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen when you say the magic words. Saying the magic words isn't what's going to get you into heaven. So what people in the church often say, well, okay, I don't have belief, but I have faith. But the thing with faith is it's an action. So like I said before, which is typically the way that people will interpret, the first interpretation that I said for John 14:6 is the traditional way that Christians interpret it, that Jesus Himself is the way, the truth. So even if you don't believe that, then you still have faith. But faith is a journey. Faith is not just a standstill area that you can just say, oh yeah, I have faith, and I said the words, and so that's it, I'm saved, I get into heaven. No, that doesn't work. If it doesn't work. So again, just because you say you have faith and you've said the magic words does not mean that you are saved. And the irony of this is most of the people who believe that and say that are the total opposite of what the Bible says a Christian should look like. I have met plenty of people and know of plenty of people who have said the magic words and who say that they have faith, but the way that they live their life is completely opposite to the way that even Jesus lived His life. And I know plenty of people and have seen plenty of people who have said the magic words and say, even though I don't believe, I have faith. But the way that they live their life is not at all a reflection of what a Christian, little Christ being the example, Jesus Christ being, they don't live at all in the loving way that Jesus lived in the Bible. So anyway, going back to belief and how it relates to salvation, what belief does is it gives you a responsibility. Because with the knowledge that's come from that experience that is salvation, that is belief, you can't choose not to believe that. Once you have experienced it for yourself, once you have tasted and seen Him for yourself, a true, authentic experience, once you have experienced that, you would not be able to turn away. Not that you would want to, but you wouldn't be able to, because if you did, it would mean that you're a hypocrite and a coward. So if you have truly experienced and you truly do believe, then you wouldn't want to turn away. Saying God is who He says He is. God is love. He is a Father. He is a loving Father. All of that. And I know that's even highly debatable with among other stuff in the Old Testament. But saying that all of that is true, if you have come into an experience and belief and you truly believe that He is God, He is Jesus, He is who He says He is, then you wouldn't want to turn away. You wouldn't want to live in truth. You wouldn't want to be a hypocrite or a coward. And you would live as Jesus lived and walked as Jesus walked, in love. And I'm not saying that you will be perfect or you'd be perfect by any means, but I am saying that is what salvation would look like, or I guess that's how salvation should look like, right? I mean, right? Am I the only one that's tracking with this? I hope not. So see, what the church does in regards to salvation and teaching salvation, that it's almost a simple elementary teaching, that salvation is the beginner's course. Salvation is what gets you into heaven. And then experiencing God and walking with God, like I talked about in my last video, is the advanced rocket science. But by everything that I just discussed, by biblical standards, biblically speaking, they are the same thing. Salvation, true salvation, should be a life-altering, life-changing experience that drastically flips your world upside down. But the church, it seems that they've watered this down to magic words. I mean, do you know, I think a lot of you can relate to me on this, how many times, how often I have seen the biblical standard of what I'm talking about, of what salvation should look like. Do you know how many times I've seen that in the church? Few to none. And I say few to none because I have seen it, and I'm still, in relationship and know of those people and friends with those people who, I do think, if Christianity is authentic and real, then they are living it out to an extent, living out that point of salvation. But it's so few that I wonder, is it a fluke? Is this all smoke and mirrors? Because I have seen a lot of magic word salvations, and I'm like, what is going on? So if this is all true, and God is real and Christianity is true, the way to interpret John 14:6, I think the second interpretation that I had makes a bit more sense, saying that, the way is to authentically seek out truth, and that way will bring you life. And, then you get the Father, heaven, all that good stuff. And by the way, I do think that authentic search and journey for truth is something that Jesus exemplified for us. Now, it's insinuated in the Gospels. It's not written in, because there's a huge gap between, when he was born to when he was like 30. But in that gap, there's like a couple verses that says, and he grew in favor with God and man. And he was obviously a very smart dude. He was an intellectual guy that was on the search for truth. He knew scriptures like the back of his hand. He did a lot of studying. This is all insinuated in the Gospels. And so by that standard, like Jesus was in search for truth and studied when his intellect and exercise, that gets into a whole different thing. But by that standard, he was on the search for truth and changing the entire landscape of what church looked like in a traditional sense to get people to the truth. So that's why the second interpretation of John 14:6 makes a bit more sense to me when looking at how Jesus lived his life. But if this is the case, I know of plenty agnostic and atheistic people who authentically seek out truth. So what does that mean for them? Even though they don't, atheists don't claim to believe in God, but they do say, I am in search of truth. And so, which, by the way, the atheists that I have talked to have said, well, if you can show me, if I have an experience with God, that God exists, then I will believe. And like I just said, and by biblical standards, the works, that our faith is to believe. That follows what the Bible says belief is. But like I said, if that is the case, does that mean agnostics, atheists, if God does exist, that if this interpretation is the correct interpretation of that, does that mean that there is a place in heaven for them, for the people who authentically seek out and live in truth? So obviously there are holes in the second interpretation, because where does Romans 10:9 come in? If you, live out your life authentically seeking out truth and wanting to know truth and being open to the fact that that could be God, maybe that's one thing. But saying that, being open to truth, seeking out truth and all of that, and then Romans 10:9 comes in and it says, confess that Jesus is your Lord. Like, how does that fit into that second interpretation? I don't know. I don't have all of the answers. But I do think that these questions that I'm asking, these things that I'm proposing, need to be thought about, because I've pondered on them for years, and there are a lot that it has to do. These are all the frustrations that I have with Christianity and the church. And going back to the third interpretation that I had for John 14:6, being with Christ consciousness, I personally don't see that consistently and logically playing out with a lot of the things that I mentioned. And so that's just what I personally think. If you all think differently, let me know down in the comments. So like I said, I don't have all of the answers, but I do think these things that I'm proposing to you, these questions that I'm asking, I do think that they need to be asked, because, you know, if salvation is a thing, if it's real, then we are taught, like if the afterlife is real, if eternity is real, then we are talking about what some Christians, what traditional Christians talk about in eternity. The people that aren't saved will spend an eternity burning in hell, where that whole topic of hell is a different video, a different topic for a different time. But you can see the importance of how we interpret these verses, because, I mean, possibly a afterlife that lasts for eternity could be at stake, whether we are in bliss or tortured for all eternity. That's a big deal. Like, I mean, do the magic words really get to dictate if you live life in eternal bliss or eternal torment? That there's something about that is wrong with it's something about that is wrong, period, not just with me, but I think a number of you can agree with me on that, hopefully. So let me know your thoughts on this video, what you think and how you interpret salvation, and what do you think about the concept of salvation. Let me know down in the comments, because I would love to talk with you more about it. And as always, guys, if you like this video, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share, and make sure you hit that bell icon so you can get notified every single time I put out a video. It would really help me out, and I'll see you misfits in the next one. Peace!